This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begins today's show. The pair talks about what fish to stock ponds with, as well as what fish should probably be avoided. Keeping the show rolling is Brian Olson, head of Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, with information about the TAPS competition in Western Kansas. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk rounds out today's show, discussing the potential causes for low productive efficiency and steps dairy producers can take to improve pregnancy and conception rates. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We got another pond episode up this week, or at least a fisheries-focused episode. So, Joe, what do you got for us today?
Yeah, I thought we'd talk about fish a little bit, jump into stocking our ponds. Ponds are starting to warm up a little bit. Good time of year to think about adding fish to them if they need it.
Well, that's definitely an important thing if you want to catch fish out of your pond. So what should I stock if I'm going to stock a pond?
Sure, get asked that question a lot, and I always ask the people back, what do you want to stock, or what do you want to catch is kind of another way to think about that. And so, coming up with a goal is important before we just throw fish into a pond. And so understanding what we want, there are some common species for sure in Kansas pond. There's kind of the trifecta that it's known as, so largemouth bass, bluegill, sunfish, and fathead minnows. That's where a lot of ponds start. That provides a good balance of having forage fish, but also some predators in there that you can enjoy catching. So those three fish are kind of a good area to start with.
So you mentioned the trifecta. What else is common?
Yeah, so people like catching channel catfish, so that's an easy fish to just go sit and have a cold cup of iced tea or whatever beverage of choice and sit there and kind of enjoy that pond a little bit differently than that active fishing with the bass. Those are common. Red ear sunfish, we'll talk about those a little more specifically in a minute, but that's a good, in addition to bluegill, another good centrarchid sunfish to have in your pond.
My main thing I like to catch when I'm fishing in ponds is bass and channel cat. Do I need to worry about stocking bluegill if I'm mainly interested in having a bass pond?
Get asked that question a lot, and the answer is yes. And so bluegill are the forage base. They're going to be the food that feeds all those predators in our pond. And so really the bluegill population in many ways is more important than the bass population. If you're not taking care of those bluegill in the right way, growing the right sizes and the right amount, your bass are never going to get to where you want them. So the bluegill population, having enough bait or enough food for your predators, your largemouth bass or whatever fish you want to catch, really important to have bluegill. You don't always need bluegill if you just want to have a pond that doesn't have predators. So if you want to have a crappie pond, for example, there's some challenges that come with that, but maybe you don't need to have bluegill. Almost always, though, those bluegill are important and required.
What about like grass carp and hybrid sunfish?
Yeah,
those sorts of critters.
Those are other fish that might be good to add to your pond. Grass carp, a lot of people think that they're, a silver bullet. You put them in your pond and all your weeds go away. And they can cause issues that, that's probably another episode, something we'd want to talk about. But grass carp are a good tool. They can be added to your pond. They're not necessarily something you'd always want to add. So same thing with hybrid sunfish. They're great if you want to have grandchildren. Your little kids go out and catch something easy, but they'll also compete with some of the other fish. So got to make sure that they're the fish that you want to have in your pond before you add them. Just think through and really understand what species, if you're adding them to your pond, what's that going to mean for your fish population?
So are there any fish that we really shouldn't put in a pond, fish we ought to avoid when we're stocking?
Yeah, there are, and I'm going to say that with the caveat that if it's your pond, right? And so if your goal is to have one of these fish, you really enjoy them, then that's great. But the fish that comes to mind to me is white crappie, and so people love to catch crappie. They do really well in big bodies of water, but in smaller ponds, generally they're just too prolific. They end up having too many babies or offspring. The other thing is that they generally spawn sooner. So if we think about crappie fishing, that's generally one of the fish that we go out and target early in the spring, right? So earliest in the season, and the reason is that they're gearing up, they're feeding to spawn early. That means that all their little larval fish or the little fry and fingerlings they're going to be growing up, a month or so in advance of some of the other fish. So they're going to be able to get some of those resources. They're going to grow faster, and eventually they can outcompete other fish. And you end up with ponds, if you see crappie in a small pond, a lot of times you'll be able to catch them on every single cast, but they'll also all be in the 4-inch range, right? So they've just used up all the resources that they can find, and they're still making babies, and every fish in there is just stunted. So that's a really hard situation to come back from once you get there. So generally, unless you have a really good management plan, don't want to add crappie to your pond.
What about bullheads? When I was a kid, man, we used to catch bullheads, and in my family, if you caught it, you ate it. And we ate a lot of bullheads when I was a kid. We also chopped them up and let them rot and used them for raccoon bait when we were trapping.
Sure. Yeah, bullhead they're prolific fish, and they just tend to they grow up to a size. They don't ever get big enough to really enjoy harvesting. Again, if you really enjoy catching bullhead, that's great, but generally wouldn't recommend them. They like to sit on the bottom of the pond and stir up a lot of that sediment, keep things moved around. And so if you want to have a nice, pretty pond that has some phytoplankton and some primary producers in there, bullhead generally aren't a great fish to have, but they served a purpose. There's a reason they were stocked in a lot of ponds back in the day, too.
Yeah. Are there any other forage fish that people might want to avoid?
Yeah, people think a lot of times shad are great. Shad are great in really big bodies of water, but in ponds they just don't work. There aren't any predators that generally eat really big shad, and shad can grow up to be 12 or 14 inches pretty quickly and pretty readily. So just sticking to kind of the sport fish and having a plan is definitely what I would emphasize.
So I guess now that we've kind of got an idea of what fish we ought to stock, when should we think about stocking a pond?
Well, there's two things you need to think about, and so when we stock a pond, it's not really a one and done. It's normally a 2-part stocking, and so this is a great time of year, the spring. That's kind of why we're talking about it. Springtime is a great time to add some fish to your pond, especially new ponds this time of year, right? And so when we stock ponds, that 2-part process, the first part would be adding the forage base. And so adding those bluegill, and with most new ponds, I'm going to recommend fathead minnows as well. And so adding bluegill, fathead minnows, and then letting them grow up and reproduce for at least a season. So if you're stocking them in the spring, I would wait until that fall, or ideally the next spring, before I add any predators to that pond. What that does is it lets you get the most bang for your buck. So you're going to add in some of those forage-based fish. Conditions are going to be right throughout the summer for them to reproduce. And instead of adding 500 bluegill, you're going to end up with 5,000 bluegill that then can be used to feed those forage fish. So 2 parts. First, stock the forage base, the bluegill and the fathead minnows in most cases, and then, like I said, a year later, either the largemouth bass or channel catfish, whatever fish you want to add on the predatory side.
What about red ears? Why would we want to have them in a pond?
You can add them in place of some of your bluegill, so they recommend, replacing about a quarter of the bluegill recommendation with red ear. The big reason, they're called shell crackers. That's one of their colloquial names, and that's because they like to eat snails. And these snails are intermediate hosts, and so the snails aren't being affected, but they're intermediate hosts for these parasites. And the parasites are trematodes. They're little yellow grubs that you can see on the fish. They get really high densities on the gills a lot of times. You might see them on the body. You can sometimes see the grubs or the eggs, black specks on the fillets. But they don't really hurt the fish. They're not bad. You can still eat the meat as long as you cook it. It's not zoonotic. It's not probably going to spread to you. So it's safe to eat, but it's unsightly. It's not something we like to see. So these shell crackers come in, they eat up those snails, and they help break that life cycle so that you can cut back on the number of parasites that you have going on in your pond.
How many fish should I put in my pond?
That's going to depend on your pond, but that's where we all end up. And so I'm going to throw out some numbers for an average Kansas pond, but these numbers can be way off. They can be off by 3 or 4 times. And so the recommendation is to start with per acre, about 500 bluegill and about 10 pounds of fathead minnows. So that's a good place to start. That doesn't mean that those are the numbers that you want to stick with, right? Sometimes, I might recommend adding 1,500 or 2,000 bluegill, depending on the pond and the amount of habitat and the amount of activity, phytoplankton, for example, that are in that pond. But those are good numbers to start with.
What about bass? How many bass should we put in?
Yep. So again, remembering that we're going to add that forage base in the spring or earlier, and then we're going to wait ideally a year, but at least, until the following fall. And then we're going to add about 100 fingerling bass into that pond. So there's a couple options. The numbers that I'm giving are for fingerlings, for smaller fish. They're generally cheaper, but if you're, you have exposable income, or you're getting older in life, or you just want to be able to fish your pond sooner, it might make sense to buy some bigger fish that you can add. And what that does is kind of buy you some time. So if you buy bigger fish, it's going to speed up the cycle to where you can be harvesting those fish about a year sooner.
Where is a good place to get fish?
Yeah, there's a lot of good producers in Kansas and throughout our region. The Kansas Aquaculture Association, most states have an aquaculture association, and most of the producers that are worth their weight or reputable have demonstrated that they're doing things the right way will be a member of their aquaculture association. That doesn't mean that every producer that's not a member is not reputable, but that's kind of a good resource to go to get started. So if you're looking to stock your fish, I would go look up the Kansas Aquaculture Association. They have a directory of producers that are well known and are going to deliver to you some good fish. That's definitely where I would start.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. If you'd like to learn about what to do with ponds that already have fish in them, you can listen to the full episode where they talk about it on the podcast streaming platform of your choice, or I will also put a link to it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show talking about the Testing Ag Performance Solutions Program, also often referred to as TAPS. And then to talk about it, we're joined by Department Head of Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, Brian Olson. Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Shelby.
Brian, this TAPS program, what is it?
Yeah, so it is a unique competition. We are going out and asking farmers to sign up into teams. So there could be anywhere from 3 to 5 farmers per team. Could actually be bankers, could be NRCS people, anybody interested in understanding about how to manage water, but primarily focused in on producers. And so what we do is we give producers the opportunity to make, let's say, 6 different decisions over the growing season. So what corn product? The first inaugural competition is going to be on sprinkler irrigated corn. And so they would have the opportunity to decide what corn product, what seeding rate, when do they want to put the fertility out, how do they want to irrigate it. These are some of the decisions that farmers will decide on. So this will be done at the Colby station there. And so everything that the farmer teams come up with will be executed out in the field by K-State faculty and staff. And what this does is it really allows farmers to try some different things out, right? They may be interested in trying a different seeding rate, a different irrigation strategy. They can put that whole system together. But what it also does, so for example, Shelby, if we go and we get, let's say, 100 to 150 farmers participating in this, we can ask industry technology companies to come in and put their technologies in that field. And then you have farmers that can then try these technologies over the growing season and determine are they beneficial or not beneficial to them in managing water. But it'd be really difficult to have these technology companies to put it out on 100 to 150 farmers' fields. But there they can put it all in that one field. Farmers can decide if they want to use it, talk about the pros and cons. And then there's a really cool thing about it. There's that peer-to-peer sharing. of ideas. Did technology A work for you, or did technology B work for you? So those are just some of the things. I mean, it's a great concept. It's about social learning, right? And going out and developing a platform that people can see how their management practices stack up against other people, or if they want to try something new, see how this new management practice stacks up against other teams.
And as we're thinking about being a team, the Kansas Water Institute is part of the team for making this happen.
Yeah, the Kansas Water Institute, again, it's going to, if things keep moving forward in the state legislature in a very positive way, it looks like it will be there at K-State. And so the Kansas Water Institute is actually making this their inaugural project they're going to sponsor. And so we're very happy to have that, because what that will do is, this isn't water, as we all know, is not just a agriculture issue. It's not a Western Kansas issue. It is a state of Kansas issue. And so this will allow, when we put out these requests for proposals, to see if there's other ideas across the multiple colleges there in K-State about what would be beneficial to have in TAPS, but then also expanding this further, also seeing if there could be some potential with some of our other university partners. And so I'm very excited about how this is going to move forward. Again, it really highlights, focuses in on the Ogallala, which, again, Ogallala is extremely important for agriculture in Western Kansas. We have to get to more sustainable water management practices, but we've got to start somewhere. And to me, this is a great place to start with this initial kickoff in Western Kansas.
Brian, before the interview, you mentioned the goal is to more find something to change the whole system and not just one thing when it comes to looking at our water issue in Kansas. Yeah,
so I've gotten into some discussions with some producers like, we just needed to change our nozzle package. And nozzle packages on your sprinkler irrigation system can be very helpful, right? But what this does is it allows you to look at the whole system. And again, the whole system is really where you can see the benefits, because we do have a highly dynamic water management systems out there. So we've got farmers that have used to have 1,000 gallon per minute wells, now only have 300 gallon per minute wells. Or maybe they are restricted in their given area on how much water they can put out. Or maybe they have low output wells and restricted. And so with these TAPS programs, and again, this is the initial one that we are doing, but with these TAPS programs, we can set this up on certain soil types. We don't have to just do it there at Colby. We plan to do it also down in Garden City, potentially in Tribune, maybe on some farmers' fields when we get the system set up. But for example, if there's a sandy environment with limited water, that would be a great area to do a TAPS program, a TAPS competition for farmers to understand how to use that water better to get the most value. Because again, we want farmers to be economical, right? We want farmers to be there in the long run, but we also want to find more water sustainable management practices, and that's where it comes back to looking at that whole system. And so this is a great path for farmers to, again, dive in and see what are going to be the things that are going to really influence water. And just so you're aware, Shelby, the teams are anonymous, right? So again, if by chance you and I were on Team 27, they're not going to call us out that Team 27 was Shelby and Brian Olson, right? But we will put some prizes forward for the top 3 teams to, highlight, were you economically the best, right? Did you go out there and raise the corn to be the most profitable? But also, did you get the most bushels per amount of water that was applied, right? So I think those types of competitions are extremely important to highlight some really good things. But again, there's no problem of calling out to the Shelby and Brian Olson team there if we were at the very bottom.
Brian, do people need to come in with their teams, or can they be placed into teams?
So typically we want people to, sign up as a team, right? But if there are people that are really interested and don't have a team, right, and are willing to come to the kickoff meeting, so the kickoff meetings on March 27th, they can reach out to the research center there in Colby to get further details. But we could place them on a team if they're willing to do that. And back to your comment, it might actually spur more conversation if they don't know where the other people are coming from to make those decisions. So if they are interested in doing that, yes, we could place them on the team. Initially here, we're thinking that most of the people would probably like to have a good working relationship with people that would be on their team to make those decisions, because you do need to kind of, let's say, have a text group. There's a question that needs to be decided. You send it out to the text. What do we want to do here? And then they move forward with inputting that information into the portal.
And a reminder that people don't have to be from Colby to be able to participate in this competition.
That is correct. And so again, this is the first one, and I think this has been done for a few years up in Nebraska. But this is the first one in Kansas. And so, yes, it's going to be done at the Colby Station, but if somebody from Scott City or Garden City or wherever in western Kansas would like to be part of this, we would be happy to have them join. And again, we do plan to move it down to other locations as we move forward, because we really see this, again, as a great way for farmers to look at the whole system, try some things out, get familiar with new technologies, and then just have that peer-to-peer learning in addition to learning from the faculty and staff that will be putting this together.
If people are wanting to find out more information about this TAPS program, how can they do that?
Yes, and so to learn more, please go to www.k-state.edu/TAPS, TAPS.
Brian, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about this TAPS program.
Yes, well, thank you, Shelby, for highlighting this opportunity in western Kansas. But again, as we talked about, water issue is something that the state of Kansas, we are diving into and trying to help farmers find that more sustainable path forward with respect to water management practices. So thank you for your time.
That was Department Head of Western Kansas Research Extension Center's Brian Olson. If you'd like to find out more information about TAPS, which is Testing Ag Performance Solutions, you can do so by going to www.k-state.edu/TAPS. Again, that is www.k-state.edu/TAPS. I will link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. And also in today's show notes, I will link the Kansas Water Institute if you'd like to find out more information about that initiative. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with milk lines. This week, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk explores the potential causes for low reproductive efficiency and how it can be improved.
Today, I'd like to challenge our Kansas dairy producers concerning the reproductive programs on their dairy farms. As I review dairy records from farms across the United States, it's amazing how many producers today actually have pregnancy rates of 40% or greater and conception rates of 50% or greater. So as we look at trying to achieve these high goals to improve the efficiency on our dairy farms, how do we do that? Well, number one, as I review things from various farms, it is very important that we have healthy cows. In other words, how are cows coming through the transition period? Do we have issues with retained placentas or metritis? Are we having a lot of difficult calvings in our herd? All of these things are going to reduce the reproductive efficiency on your dairy. So as we start to think about these things, one of the important things is the voluntary waiting period. So when are you going to first inseminate animals? Many farms are successful using a voluntary waiting period of anywhere from about 60 to 80 days. However, keep in mind, as you get closer to that 80-day mark for your voluntary waiting period, it's probably important that you're very efficient with getting cows pregnant soon after that. If you're having a little bit of difficulty, you may want to consider a voluntary waiting period of about 60 days. Now, how do we detect animals in heat? This is really important as we look at heat detection rates from these farms that have high overall reproductive efficiency. Many of them will have heat detection rates of 80% or better. So, how are you going to detect heat? A lot of farms are successful using timed AI programs and various hormone treatments, and those can be very effective, as well as other things that we can incorporate, such as technology. So many farms are actually using activity monitoring systems to detect heat activity in their animals, and they can be very successful at this. However, this is all dependent on consistent activity within the pen. In other words, we have to do the same thing every day. So if we're turning animals out to pasture or we're sorting animals on certain days of the week, this will actually interfere with a consistent activity pattern for the animal, which will negatively impact the ability of these systems to detect animals in heat. So if you're going to be using activity meters to determine whether or not an animal is heat, you have to ensure that your protocols around the farm ensure consistent activity across the days. Now, as we think about various programs that we can employ for timed AI, there are many out there and they're all effective. Some may be a little more effective than others. Seems as though probably the most popular are the OVSync programs. And again, those can be used in combination with the activity meter systems. In other words, you have to draw a line in the sand. If you haven't inseminated a cow by a certain time based on detecting standing heat or using an activity meter, you're going to need to start her on a timed AI program so that she can become pregnant on time. Next thing that you need to consider to be successful is how you're handling pregnancy testing. We need to determine which animals did not become pregnant from the service, and we need to make sure that we do that very efficiently. In general, we can start that as early as 28 days after insemination. Many farms now wait about 32 days to ensure that we catch all animals that might lose a fetus early in pregnancy and improve our overall detection of animals that are still open. Now, the last thing that you need to check in your record is to make sure you're including all eligible animals in your breeding protocols, whatever they might be. So check your data to make sure that you're not missing some animals on shot programs and that those animals get enrolled as soon as possible. And then the final thing to think about as you look at your overall efficiency, making sure if you're using a timed AI program with hormone injections that those are being given in the correct manner so that they are effective. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.